Thank you, Brandon, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. And I want to encourage you, if you have questions, to be sure and let us know what those questions are, and we'd be glad to try to answer them to the best of our ability. Tonight, this first question that I want to talk about is, can a Christian, get into politics? And, it's hard to tell what exactly was being envisioned by those that were interested in this question. Whether they were thinking, as a Christian, can I run for office and be elected? Or can I support a candidate for office? Or can I even vote? Believe it or not, the Christians through the decades, even here in the United States, have struggled with those questions, even the last one. And so I want to just sort of walk you through three different viewpoints on this topic, because I think it's important that we recognize where people are coming from, make sure we're listening to what they're saying and their perspective, so that we can more effectively understand and then respond to their concerns. So let me show you the first slide here. And the first viewpoint, or camp, if you will, that I want us to think about are Christians who take the position that they should never get involved in politicking. And I really think it's interesting that this phenomenon is still around. One of the challenges of the premise is some of the verses that you can read, like in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3, where it talks about how, as Christians, we're to be strangers and exiles on the earth. Some translations say pilgrims, right? And that suggests maybe you don't get as involved in leading and growing a nation because your kingdom is in heaven. And yet, their theme song would be something like, those in this camp is something like, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through, right? And so they maintain that a Christian's focus should be on getting to heaven, helping other people get to heaven, and that they should not be focused on worldly things, right? And I understand that mindset. I know that the world is distracting and that sins come from our desires for the flesh and for power and influence and whatnot. And I think that it's important that we understand where they're coming from a standpoint of minimizing the temptation and keeping their focus on, first things first, right? Probably the most well-known person to hold this view in Churches of Christ is the namesake of Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee, David Lipscomb. He took the position after going through the horrific horrors of the Civil War and all the pain and anguish and acrimony. He took the position that Christians really are better off staying out of civil government altogether. And he wrote a series of articles that later was compiled in the form of a book called On Civil Government. Folks in this camp see politics as prohibited by passages such as 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, where it says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." Now, that's a powerful verse that they see as saying there's us and there's them, right? And we are the sojourners and the exiles. And we're to stay away from all this worldly stuff. And we are not them, but we'll have to walk among them. But we have to be careful as we walk among them to keep our conduct honorable, so that they'll see our good deeds and they will be able to, know that we were right when Jesus comes back. Now, that's a challenge, no doubt, to meet. But the question is, do you have to stay out of politics in order to meet that edict? And for these never politickers, if I can use that term, it's more than not just getting caught up in worldly activities. They don't have a problem with Christians, for example, holding a secular job. They would point to people like the Apostle Paul, who was a tent maker, and they'd say, that's fine. Everybody's got to feed their family. In fact, the Scriptures say that if you don't take care of your family, you're worse than an infidel, right? And so that is not their concern really, that you can't focus on the material because everybody has to survive in this life. Instead, what they're saying is something a little more negative about politics. They're suggesting that politics is inherently evil, that it causes you to compromise your values. Intrinsically, it's going to lead you to lose your integrity, right? That's the implication of the folks that take this view. They see it as something that is inherently defiled, and it's inevitably going to cause us to be defiled if we get wade into it. Now, if you think about it for a moment, I don't know about you, but I've noticed in the last couple of years that is becoming more and more true, it seems to me. And in fact, most Americans have found, the Pew Research Center did a recent poll, and they polled several countries, especially European countries and the United States, and we were at the top of the list for those that would say that they would agree with the statement, most politicians are corrupt. 2 out of 3 Americans say, yep, that's right. Most politicians are corrupt. And that's a sad statement about our state of affairs and government and politics in this country. But, where there's smoke, there's fire. And there is an increasing, at least perception that politics can be a dirty business. And so maybe the Christians in this no-politic arena may be onto something. They see a distinction in verses like 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, which says, "First of all, then I urge that supplications and prayers and intercessions and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and for all who are in high positions." But notice that distinction between us praying for them and them being the kings and those in high positions. And that we may lead a peaceful life. Right? That's why we're praying for them, so that we can leave more of this quiet, under the radar kind of life, quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. And so we're in the world, but we're not of the world. And God His plan is not for us to remove ourselves from society. He wants everybody to come to a knowledge of the truth, and He sent us as His emissaries to get there, to communicate to them that gospel truth, so that they too can have a relationship with Him. And so it's a weird situation for us to be advocating as Christians. We want to stay in this community. We want to enjoy all the benefits and privileges of being an American, and we want the government to do its job and keep us safe. We like the police, we like the fire department, we like all these things, but we're not going to step up and help you run it. And it's this weird position, but it's not out of judgment so much as it is out of a desire for us to be living this peaceful life that allows everyone that's a Christian to help anyone draw near to God, right? And you're not in one camp or the other. And so I can see part of the appeal of being sort of the Switzerland in politics, right? Of being that neutral person who's like, look, I love you both, whether you're wearing red or blue tonight. And that is part of what I think a Christian's called to do, is to not be a respecter of persons and play favorites, but to try to lead every person to Christ. Now, this view, though, I think fails to account for a couple of things, because it fails to account for the fact that the Bible views government as an instrument of God too, not just the church, not just us as individual Christians. And so politics is the work of a divinely created institution. Look at Romans chapter 13, starting in the very first verse. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those who exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." So government, politics, was God's idea. Okay? And God has chosen to use civil governments to carry out His will in the civil sphere. And I think that's something that they too easily dismiss, that God could possibly do any good through any vehicle other than the church. And the truth is that He has more than one vehicle. I would make the same point about truth, right? A lot of us focus on the fact that the Bible is the final authority for God, final authority of truth. And it's God's Word, and that's absolutely right. But that's not the only way He communicates truth. He communicates truth through natural means as well. There's the consequence of sin. There's your deep conscience. There's this ability for us to infer things from the way creation is designed and the way human bodies are designed. And so God has a special revelation through the Bible and a general revelation through natural law. But at the same time, the same point can be made about God's use of the church and civil government. And while the church certainly has it's called the pillar of truth because it has the keys to the kingdom, it has the gospel, that message that can save you and save your soul for an eternity. But at the same time, there are still things that God can accomplish for the good through the government and politics. And so I think they sometimes forget that. Look at another verse in Romans 13 before we leave it. Verse 4, it says, "For He," talking about the rulers, "is God's servant for your good." Do you see it? He's, you think about Paul being a servant of Jesus Christ, right? To preach the gospel and to accomplish much good, and that's true. But your local congressman is also a servant of God for your good. And then it talks about one of the primary things that government does, and that is they mete out justice, right? It says, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for He does not bear the sword in vain. In other words, He carries out justice. He wields the sword of justice. And for He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And so this concept of government playing the role of the person who would uphold justice by punishing the wrongdoers and rewarding those who do good dates all the way back to the Old Testament, to the story of Noah. And when Noah came off the ark, one of the first things that God said in this new world where you're going to have to repopulate and reform societies and government is in Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 and 6. It says, "And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. For whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in His own image." Right? What is one of the most fundamental, important human rights that we recognize now in society? It's the idea that every human being has intrinsic value, right? And it's wrong to murder them, and it's wrong to diminish that. And that reality, God set in motion the institution of government, of man enforcing that principle, right? And so if you take someone's life, He expected that to be reckoned, or you to be held accountable for that by your fellow man. That's, I think, a divine instruction to set up a government and a justice system, a system of justice. Now, one of the never politic views that I think, one of the other reasons why I don't adopt a never politic view is because I think they miss the importance of stewardship, right? Let me ask you, if I was to quote Jesus in Matthew chapter 25, He says, "For to everyone who has more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away." Think about all that we have in this great country in which we're living. We have been blessed to live in a democracy. Now, I'm not saying it's the greatest country on earth. Okay, well, maybe I am. But that blessing is something we shouldn't take for granted. And we need to understand that we have a fundamental responsibility to keep that and take care of that and make sure that it's not lost, right? And so in a democracy, how does it work? Well, the government is going to derive its authority from the people. It's of the people and by the people, right? And so voting, I would consider a matter of stewardship. I think that it's important to understand that if you fail to exercise your vote, it's a failure to exercise God's authority that He's given to you. And what you're doing when you vote is you are delegating your responsibility to accomplish justice and show mercy and do other good works here on this earth, to reward those who do good and punish those who do evil. You're delegating that to someone else. And so if you choose those people for selfish reasons, you choose those people willy-nilly, right, without proper due consideration, then you're being negligent in carrying out your duty by delegating it to someone that you don't know or trust. And so I think we need to think again about the importance of the stewardship of and the fact that you can't never get involved in politics without failing to be good stewards of what God has given us. And so if it's not inherently wrong to vote for someone that you are delegating the sword-bearing responsibility to do justice to, then how can it be wrong to help promote their campaign? Or how can it be wrong for you to actually run for that office as well? And so I'm not sure the Never Politic group ultimately is persuasive. So look at the second possibility, and that is that those that are focused on nothing but politics. There are Christians that have become, I guess I got to use the word obsessed with social justice. They have become so focused on trying to, make this country we live in heaven on earth, that they have forgotten that this world is not going to last forever, and that there is a heaven yet to come. And so for me, it's important that we recognize that you have to prioritize things in life. And as important it is for you to have a family and to dote on your children and to raise them up and the joy that you get from that, they're not the most important thing. As important as your spouse is, they're not the most important thing. As important as your country is, they are still not the most important thing. Jesus said, seek first the kingdom of God, and all these other things will be added unto you. And so anyone who has swung to the opposite extreme because of the never politicers to say, it's all about politics, and this is where I'm going to make a difference, and they start forgetting about the importance of trying to save souls for Christ and redeem people one by one, and they're trying to make these sweeping social changes to somehow recreate heaven on earth, I think they're missing the point. It's not that they don't have good intentions. It's not that we shouldn't want to eradicate racism. It's not even that I don't appreciate Rawlsian justice and the idea that true justice requires you to recognize that not everybody starts at the same starting line, and we need to be willing to redistribute wealth in this country and make sure everybody has an opportunity to get a good education or to have health care and those sorts of things. But those issues are secondary. And if we have to use up all of our energy just trying to get the next political agenda passed, then we're going to not have an opportunity to reach the world for God. And I think that's an important point. We should never equate the church's mission with the platform of a political party. Not only because there's no political party that's perfect, right? They're all imperfect, as all individuals are imperfect, right? But also because it's going to be a distraction, and it's going to tempt us to put our trust in humans. I remember when I first went to Italy for the first time as a college student, seeing the statue of David. And if you look at the statue of David, it's not in proper proportions. The thing that's out of proportion are the hands of David. And the reason why he has these huge hands is because during the Renaissance, the philosophy was that man can do anything, right? And I think that's the slippery slope you get on when you get on the social justice train and you stop focusing on what God's plan is to redeem man and you try to fix it all yourself. You run the risk of human beings thinking they're the answer when in fact the only one that's ever going to be able to fight against, solve racism, or deal with discriminatory animus of any kind, or ensure equal rights. The only one that's going to be able to do that is Jesus Christ. The gospel of Jesus Christ changing one heart at a time. And then from that transformed mind, as Romans 12 talks about, you could see a much more kind and gentler nation being formed. So there's a third view that I want to highlight, and this is about what I call biblical politics, right? And this is the idea that we can do both. That it's not an either-or situation. That as a Christian, you can be an ambassador for Christ and you could be a civic leader. Any Christian that loves Jesus and that loves their neighbor, I think, can't stay completely out of the political arena. Philosophically, I think most Christians are in this third camp. But I think there's a further divide that we ought to be aware of, and that is that one side of this third camp is focused on the idea that these are two different spheres, and never the two shall meet. And as a result, on Sunday, they think and act like a Christian. But on Monday, when they take that office, or when they cast that vote, or when they decide whether they want to support this candidate or that candidate, it has nothing to do with church. It has nothing to do with their religious beliefs or their faith. That's politics, and they're two different worlds. And they basically take the position that being a Christian has nothing to do with whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, or you vote for this candidate or that candidate. It's a strict separation of church and state kind of a model, where you can get involved in politics as a Christian and you can do your work as a Christian, but the two have nothing to do with each other. The other version of this third view that I see is the idea that evangelism or church and politics or government actually overlap like a Venn diagram. And the idea is that where they overlap, where there is clear biblical teaching at stake, where they are dealing with an issue over here in our society that is clearly, there's clear guidelines from God on how to handle that situation. In this area, you have to understand that the Word of God is the ultimate authority. And you have to understand your responsibility as a Christian must come first. So you accomplish change here on earth, and I think that's part of God's plan. To glorify Himself and to show people the love of God and to lead people. Sometimes the way you learn about God is to see the consequences of sin and see the transformational difference of someone whose life has been changed by Jesus. And yet it's like two sides of the same coin. And that we, I believe, should attack social justice issues of injustice, right? But understand that that's ultimately secondary to saving their soul. So a Christian can be in politics, but they've got to do so with a biblical mindset. And this means that they've got to faithfully apply biblical principles to current political challenges. So let me say one last thing about this. And that is that I think a lot of people forget that while it's wrong for me to do something directly, maybe it's not so bad if I just vote for or let somebody else do it for me. It's going to benefit me and my family. I need those material resources, and so I may just let somebody else do what I know I shouldn't be doing because it'll be of some advantage to me. And I want to just make this point that if you're going to do biblical politics, you got to remember that politics is never an excuse to compromise who you are as a Christian. That directly, of course, you can't use politics as an excuse to do wrong, right? And rationalize that, well, the end justifies the means. You can't voluntarily participate in promoting sin, right? Even if you use a euphemism to describe it like freedom or liberty or lifestyle choice. But the second point is equally important, and that is that you can't do it indirectly. So let me show you a couple of reasons why. And the first one is you can't indirectly help somebody do something that you know would be wrong for you to do if you have the wrong intention, because intentions matter. If you're doing it for selfish reasons, just for material gain, and you know that society will not be better off and that they themselves will be culpable for what they've done, it's wrong. Instead, we've got to be able to look like Philippians 4:8 and focus on whether or not what we're doing and what we're participating in is honorable, right? True, just, pure, lovely, commendable. If it's about excellence, about integrity and virtue, right? If there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And so your mindset when you're engaging in politics matters. It's not about how much power you can get. It's not about how popular you can get. It's not about what's in it for you or your loved ones or your family or your state or even your country. The question is it the right thing to do? Is it really excellent? Is it virtuous? Is it true? And that's the way we've got to be making these decisions. But acting indirectly, you've also got to think about maintaining adequate distance, right? Or having good reasons. So let me show you, intention of the heart and good reasons go together. And you need to be able to demonstrate why you were engaged in those politics or supporting that person, and make sure your heart's right and that you had good intentions, like the passage in Philippians. Now the third point, though, is you need to maintain some distance. Because you're not going to agree with everything whoever you voted for does or says. The question is not whether or not you can vote for someone knowing that they're going to make a mistake, because that's always going to be true. The question is, how close are you, how involved are you in facilitating that mistake, that error, that moral failure? Does that make sense? If that's something that he did or she did on their own watch, and you didn't put $1 into helping them do that, you didn't promote that on a billboard, and you weren't advocating that, it's just they had a moral lapse of judgment. That's called being human. And you're as far in terms of distance from that as you can be. And that, I think, is where you want to be when it comes to moral failures from politicians. Look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. It says, "For such is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God." And the idea is that we need to understand that when we're associated with people, when we're engaged in a project with other people, that it is guilt by association. And we need to recognize if there is something that's going in the wrong direction, we've got to step back and say, I'm not going to be a part of that. I support you. I really want, to accomplish a lot of good with you. But on this issue, I got to say no. And there is a true responsibility, right, to make sure that we're acting in accordance with God's will. Now, the fourth point is that we've got to be willing to speak up, which goes along with this. Ephesians 5:11, "Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them." It's not enough for you to step back. You've got to understand you've got a responsibility, if God has put you in that position, to speak up. And take a firm stand and speak up for what is right. And I think a lot of folks either are afraid to speak up, or they don't know what to say. But we have to prepare ourselves, if we're going to, as Christians, get involved in the political arena, to know the issues and to know where God's standards are in that regard, and to speak up. And then the last point is that above all, we've got to protect our reputation. At the end of the day, if you do the best you can to only associate with those that from your heart you believe are going to accomplish good, and you've got good reasons for why that person you think is someone you ought to be associated with, and when they do something that's morally not right, you step back and you even step up and speak on it. At the end of the day, if it's still going to taint your reputation as a Christian, if it's going to bring reproach upon the church which you are associated with, then I think the principle from the Bible is you just say no, that you decline that opportunity. Because at the end of the day, your reputation is so critical Because whether you win that election or not, you still got to get to heaven. You got to help other people get to heaven. And if you destroy your reputation in the process of winning on the political level, you may miss an opportunity to lead people to a spiritual level. So I'm going to stop there, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this question. And I hope that this is helpful in helping you navigate the political arena in the next few months for midterms and in the future elections.